Hi everybody, thank you very much for joining us this Monday lunchtime to discuss culture with the specific lens of cultural challenges organisations experience when they are merged or acquired. I'm Katie Kelly, I'm a change consultant at Oakland as well as a board member for CMI London. And as a change manager, clearly cultural transformation is very important for lots of the work I do and lots of the work that the fellow panellists have done as well. And also something I'm personally very intrigued with. So I'm very excited to be chatting about it today. So as mentioned, as a change manager, many of my change programs do involve cultural change because changing technology or process isn't where the change finishes. We often have to change behaviours to achieve the true benefits of transformation. And this comes to the fore when we're thinking about integration of companies, especially, which we're going to delve into a bit more today. And again, we're going to talk about these in more detail, but of some of the myriad of ways that you can achieve true culture change, we might want to think about ensuring the transformation is connected to the values and strategy of a company or companies, as we're going to talk about. Ensure messages are embedded into every employee touch point. So that includes recruitment, succession planning, performance management as an example, and also ensure that messages are communicated consistently and relentlessly by influencers, change makers, and leaders of an organisation, which, as mentioned, I'm sure we'll touch on today with the lens of mergers and acquisitions in particular. So today I'm joined by Mark Walker and Grant Layton of Oakland and also Becky Pettifer of UKHSA, who have worked across a number of transformations involving companies merging or being acquired, as well as carve-outs as well. So I'm going to pass to them in a second to introduce themselves fully and give some opening remarks on the hidden cost of culture in M&A. And also we have received some submitted questions in advance of this session, which we will cover as we explore the topic, but please do pop any more questions in the comments section there. We'd be really interested to hear your thoughts and answer any more as we move through the event. So I will pass to Grant, first of all.
Great. Thanks, Katie. Hi, everyone. Grant Layton here. As Katie mentioned in her introduction, I'm an associate partner at Oakland. I've been with Oakland about 3.5 years. And if anyone isn't familiar with Oakland, some of you probably not, we're a management consultancy headquartered in Soho in central London. And we help organizations to tackle their most pressing challenges through a sort of multidisciplinary approach to management consulting. So we do everything from traditional strategy consulting through to digital, through to mergers and acquisition support. And so one of the key things that I've been involved with in my 3.5 years at Oakland has been supporting a number of organizations that we'll talk about at considerable length here with mergers and acquisitions journeys, sort of in different flavors. And so a little bit of background about me, as you may be able to tell, I am an American, came up at Accenture for about 8 years in America before moving over to the UK. And so in my time at Accenture, one of the most interesting and most sort of preliminary views I had of mergers and acquisitions when I was part of one. Accenture bought a company and were very, very quick to start integrating the locations and the business model. They had acquired a company for the purpose of acquiring the clients, basically buying a new market segment. And when it came down to it, there was a bit of a culture clash and a bit of an expectation gap. And so that was the first opportunity I had in my career to see sort of both sides of the acquisition and talk to people who had been acquired, and then also talk to my colleagues on the Accenture side, and we had to work out quite quickly a number of strategies to help to bridge that gap. And so that helped me to form a lot of views on what works and what doesn't. And then having moved into my career over the last 3.5 years at Oakland, the couple of clients that I've helped with mergers and acquisitions journeys have been both on the On the remaining side of an organization where there had been a divestment, and we had to very quickly recreate a number of capabilities that had been divested, and deal with some of the cultural issues where there wasn't necessarily willingness on the part of the organization that had been divested to help us go through everything that they just spent years and years doing again very quickly. And so understanding and seeing how the cultural side of that really made a difference and really had an impact on our ability to execute on the post divestment transformation plans was quite stark. And then also helping an organization to execute a three-way merger. So taking three organizations, merging them into one. Three organizations in the public sector with very different cultures and varying levels of strength in their cultures. Some were newer, some were quite established, and so traversing the learning curves and helping our clients to come together as one was quite a challenge, and we'll speak more about that as we go on. So that's it for me.
Thanks, Grant. Becky?
Yeah, Becky Pettifer. So I'm from the UK Health Security Agency. I've worked in the civil service for 19 years now, so quite a while, and always in the project delivery profession. So my experience kind of spans across a varying a varying amount of different either mergers or acquisitions, which look at when the civil service acquired private companies, or where there have been small and large civil service departments that then merge, which I'm sure you can imagine is quite a conflict of culture from that perspective. And then also worked, as Grant was mentioning, on departments that were either well established or mature in their way of thinking and in their culture and processes, versus ones that were spun up quite quickly and were still kind of establishing who they are, and then they're having to merge with someone else. So that's been really interesting throughout my career. And I've also led a lot of those programs where I've been directly affected by the change, which comes with lots of challenges, and also puts a different kind of angle and lens on how you implement and influence that change, especially when the people that you are delivering this for you may know and have relationships with, and have also got to maintain those relationships post merger or acquisition, and you can't just walk away. You've got whatever you do will be recognised and seen post implementation. So yeah, lots of different views and experience on that. I'm looking forward to exploring that more today.
Thank you.
Yes, Mark Walker. Like Grant, I'm an associate partner at Oaklin. I've spent the last few years working across a number of M&A deals, particular focus on separations and divestments and carve-outs, and integrations across utility and financial services sectors. And actually, similarly to Grant as well, actually one of my first experiences with sort of a cultural clash during a merger was actually when it was being done to myself about 10 years ago, working for a UK business where a Canadian company came in to buy a merge with my business, and it was actually a trigger point for me to change my career. And it wasn't the sole reason, but it was a contributing factor, and it can be quite disruptive to staff when mergers and acquisitions are happening. I think for me, why are we talking about this now? I think the impact of a merger or acquisition on the culture of business isn't a new concept, and I think it's not. It's been something that is undervalued and regularly ignored during deals, but I think it's becoming more important to start talking about it again now. Talent and people is becoming a key differentiator for businesses in order to succeed and maximize their value and do the best for their customers. So if you don't get that right, your merger or your acquisition is likely to be challenged. So I think it is the right point now to start saying, actually, as long as as well as the financial and legal aspects of any deal, trying to elevate the importance of culture and how you manage cultural differences and cultural change during the transition that any business will go through during M&A. You need to consider that with equal importance. And I think it is regularly overlooked, the culture, as I said. I think it's really easy when you're doing M&A deals to think about the financial aspects and the legal aspects, because they are a bit more black and white. There's ambiguity to them. Unlike culture, it's very hard for us to necessarily measure culture and know what to do with it and make it happen. What does that even mean? So I think it is again a chance for us to think about how we stop overlooking its importance.
And Mark, just to pick up on one thing before we move on, when you said at the very beginning that you had a merger/acquisition done to you as part of an organization, it was totally unsurprising to me that about 30 seconds later you said that you left that organization, you went a different direction in your career. And I think that's just indicative of the fact that when organizations feel like change is being done to them in this context, often that signals that there's been some sort of a failure or an insufficient focus on merging the cultures together. And so I think we can definitely talk about that as a theme to help with making these more successful as transactions.
That's it. Yeah, it's exactly who are these people? What are they doing to me? And why haven't they spoken to me yet? It makes you look elsewhere. And I think it is. Why is it that culture is so important, and retention of talent and keeping the people is right up there with one of the main reasons why culture is so important to consider.
For sure. Yeah, collaboration is key, I think, in any change, isn't it? Making sure that both parties or multiple parties are involved in actually helping shape what that culture looks like, not being told this is what your culture will be and you will step into that culture and everything will be fine, for sure. So if we think about pre-merger, so when you're actually in the planning stages of a merger or acquisition, and this is relevant to any change, and as a change manager, I often get frustrated that change management is brought in a month before go live of the technology system or any kind of transformation. You do a bit of training, you tell people what's changing, and everything's going to be fine, as long as you hang around for a couple of weeks after said transformation. It doesn't ever work. And on my current client, who is a large global methanol producer, I was actually in a state of luxury, really. I was brought in very early on. So at the same time as the project manager, as soon as the business case was signed off, to help start planning what that change looks like, not a position you're often in. So I feel very, very lucky to have had an impact on the planning process before we actually deliver the change as well. So when we think about mergers and acquisitions in particular, what do we need to think about culturally prior to a merger actually happening? Or what do we need to think about from a due diligence perspective when we think culturally about mergers and acquisitions?
Sorry, I was going to say, for me, it's about what the driver is for that change, and we touched on that if it's being done to you or anything like that, because that sets the tone for the whole process, really, and you need to plan accordingly. So I think it's actually acknowledging and establishing what is driving this change. Is it led from a financial perspective? Is it, often from my situation, it's because it's been a government directive that it's got to happen by X date, and so I think that's really important for me. And then also what good looks like. So why is this happening, and why is it happening to these people? How will they perceive it, and then what in their eyes would good look like? So just a different, which, as I said, that kind of sets the tone. And I don't think you can plan or establish what any of the actual tangible steps are until you've looked at what's driving it and what you want it to look like.
I think with M&A, it's a very strange situation, because you unlike the change you were articulating, Katie, many businesses are going through several phases of identifying who they're going to buy, and then some due diligence before the actual transaction takes place and an actual merger takes place. And you have to remember at that early stage, there's nothing you can do, there's nothing you can change, you're not really in control of that business you're buying. And I think at that stage, you do see most of the focus is on value, synergies, growing your market share, increasing your scale. That's what the focus is, and culture tends to take a back seat at that point because I guess people think there's not much I can do about it right now. And I think the other thing to consider as well, sort of pre-merger, is you don't have the access to the people of the organisation as much. You know, you're in this sort of negotiation period, just trying to work out whether this business is right for you to buy. So it's very hard for you to then really understand the people side of that business. You know that some of the deal is potentially market sensitive, and you're still trying to work out the intricacies of a particular transaction, and that means you're going to have not know the answers to many questions that the people in the business are going to have. You know, what will my job look like in the future? Will I have a job in the future? So you're very cautious about talking to your people and what this will mean to them, because they will have questions you can't answer. And that's a very tricky position for acquirers to be in.
I was just going to add to that. It's a really interesting point you make, that you don't have access to normally at least half of the transaction, so half of the organisation that is going to kind of merge, and you're relying on leadership to be able to articulate what the culture is like, and they often have a very different view to what the culture is like compared to everybody kind of on the front line, the grassroots of the organisation. So interesting, because leadership are obviously very important when it comes to transformation, but you don't get the full picture.
And there are not always artifacts that can fill that gap.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in a mature organization, there should be lots of artifacts and places where the organization is written down and characterized, and created a lot of color around how the organization works. What's important to the organization. What makes the people tick.
Mm-hmm.
How is performance management done. What are the priorities? How are those being filtered? Both down and up as far as the workforce goes. But a lot of organizations, especially organizations that are targets for acquisition, may not have that. And so, as Mark mentioned, you reinforced, Katie. Often you have to sort of take leadership's word for it, and that's not always an easy position to be in, and it doesn't always drive the best results.
No, and I guess that doesn't mean you can't do anything at all. I think it's a challenge and nuance to M&A, which is quite exciting. But I think most acquiring businesses are going to have to think about at this stage what they will do with culture when it comes to the merger. What is it they can do? What can they find out now? And start building change management plans and cultural integration plans before, so that when the deal does complete, and hopefully complete, can you put that plan into action immediately? And I think when you're going through any deal, there'll be certain aspects that will be clearly different. It could be a geographical difference, or the customer bases are different, or your product ranges are different, or whatever it might be. So some of those things will inevitably be obvious where there could be some cultural clashes and differences. But I think even if those things are less obvious, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't think about where there could be differences.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're going to have to start gathering some form of data around this at the due diligence stage, pre-merger stage. And like I said, you might not have access to many of the people, but there are ways you can potentially survey and do some form of assessments. There are reviews of the businesses online, research, leadership interviews, or mid-management interviews where you can as well, just to get an understanding of what a business might be like that you're buying. And I think the key thing is really at this stage, you want to try and understand what your cultural similarities are, what your cultural differences are, what are the likely behaviours you're likely to see, where there could be tension that's going to be caused, because those are the things you're going to need to jump on and manage pretty quickly after any merger or acquisition.
I think it's identifying who are those key players, as you alluded to as well, of who are the key influencers in this, because if you can work that out and establish that early on, that makes a huge difference, because there will be some key people that will have a huge amount of sway or influence, and you need to work out who those are fairly quickly, because otherwise could derail things, but also can be your best advocate as well. So that kind of, not to be all project managery stakeholder mapping, but that is incredibly key, and not just go in with and taking everyone's word, for example. There's a little bit of emotional intelligence I think you've got to play into. Who are these people, and who is that? They may say that's their role, they may that, but actually on what they are on paper and what their role is in reality can be very, very different. So
they can serve as a force multiplier for the change management efforts.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
And I guess the other thing to think about just before we move on, the pre-deal, is would you ever walk away from a deal because the culture doesn't work, or you feel there's going to be too many clashes? I don't think that happens that often. And should it? I think it's kind of an open question, really. Having done some form of assessment or diligence around how difficult that's going to be, would you walk away? And I'd probably, on balance, think if the financials work and the legals work, you probably wouldn't, because you can manage the culture and you can manage those differences over time. Whereas if the numbers don't add up, what's the point anyway?
Well, but I think that's the key sort of logical trap that a lot of organizations fall into, is they think, oh, this is a soft thing. This isn't hard. Dollars and cents, pounds and pence. These are proper factors that can very much make or break a transaction. And the experience that I mentioned, being part of one of these transactions, being part of one of the organizations that merged, most of the people in that acquired organization ended up leaving in the course of a year, and people were definitely factored into the financial value of the transaction, and we may have ended up acquiring their client accounts, and we may have ended up acquiring their capabilities on paper. But if all the people who underpin those capabilities and have made that acquired organization what it was, most of them leave because they don't like the new culture, then that really dilutes the value that you get from this. So I think, Mark, you're right. Often this is viewed as sort of a second tier thing as far as due diligence goes, but the real world impacts can be just as significant as legal issues or anything else.
I'm going to pick up on something each of you have mentioned, which about cultural KPIs. So then, Grant, you mentioned people leave. So is that an indication of
retention? Is definitely a huge KPI.
And any other cultural KPIs that people have drawn on to measure success after merger and acquisition or acquisition?
I think if you do have to measure attrition. I think once you start measuring, if that's going to be your primary thing, you're going to start measuring before you act, then you've obviously missed the boat. So I think the other thing obviously is sounds a bit cliche, but pulse surveys and really understanding what the attitudes and the happiness is across your staff as well. I mean, this is obviously probably talking post-merger, really, when you're able to do that. But have some real good feedback loops from your staff is going to be a big one.
Yeah. I think the reason I asked that in this as part of the questions that we were talking about pre-merger is because you have to record some kind of baseline, don't you, from both organisations to measure that afterwards, not just take a pulse survey 6 months later and say everyone seems quite happy, but are they actually not as happy as they were before? Yeah, so that's why.
I always think it's interesting to see how many of the more long-term employees make it through to the organisation, and sometimes that's not a bad thing. Like sometimes it's right for those people to move on, and they're there to support the transition, but actually they're not going to be part of it. And I think it's good to acknowledge that not everyone will make it through, but it does also show how vastly different it is if you've got and there's that knowledge transfer, and actually saying the value of that company or department when you've lost a lot of that sort of historical intelligence of what it's going to look like and how it was built and how it got to where it is now and got to the company that person wanted to acquire. So acknowledging that and seeing, you're saying you're monitoring attrition, but who are those key people or key roles, and actually as a KPI, how many long-standing employees are still with us after day one, and see a future at the new department or company.
And incentivizing those employees to stick around for a certain period of time is, a well-trodden path, and it's definitely an established tool in the M&A toolbox as far as creating time vesting, stock options, things like that. But often those are not put in place for the purpose of ensuring that there's a smooth cultural transition. Often those are more of a business performance related measure that are put in place. But very very much to the previous point about cultural melding and the success of the cultural integration being such a key aspect of the financial success and the business success of these transactions means that they very much serve multiple purposes, and right alongside, I think understanding the collectiveness of the culture. How much do the organizations that are taking part in this think as one versus how much of an individualistic, how much latitude do employees have to be individuals, or are they expected to fall in line and to toe the corporate line and to be part of the whole, and that can vary tremendously across companies. And so from a KPI perspective as well, having an objective way of measuring just how collective or individualistic the organization's cultures are can go a long way to helping you predict how successful you're likely to be in the first few months of a transaction.
Thank you. Before we get on to, I can see there's some questions coming in live. We've had a few submitted in advance. So we had a question from Lance: how to best approach harmonizing culture between offshored, transversal functions and core production offices. Very specific, and I'm sure that we could talk about it for a while, but has anybody got any initial thoughts for Lance?
I think there's multiple factors there, isn't there? And I think if we're talking about sort of matrix organization, vertical versus horizontal functions, and then you throw in the offshore and geographical differences, there are lots of complexities there. And I think you're trying to work with vertical functions, the core production offices in this example, that are probably sort of emphasizing a hierarchy and outcomes and measurements versus the horizontal functions, which are prioritizing equality and supporting the business. And I think that inevitably brings different systems, different processes, different types of people into those organizations. So that there will be differences in between those functions, and I think that's fine. And there's never a sort of a silver bullet to these situations. Say, okay, we'll do this and we'll feel fully integrated. For me, there's probably two things that spring to mind in this scenario of that I would want to see. And I think firstly, it would be shared vision and values across all of those functions, so that each of the functions can implement those in their own unique way that suits them, but at least they are common across the company. Obtaining that sort of commonality is you probably have to lift it above the systems and processes that are going to be different. And secondly, I think the other thing that's quite tangible as well is creating a better understanding and appreciation of each other's functions. Even if you can't fully get them to align on every aspect, at least have some appreciation of what the other one has to deal with, what the other challenges are, and that could just be an exchange program, sharing, sending people to the other locations, getting them to understand the businesses or the functions in this case. Or it might be blogging or some sort of advocacy champion type model that allows some better integration, even if you can't solve the differences.
Thank you. And then we also had a question from Graham. I'd be interested to hear views on dealing with acquisitions where the acquired company has a stronger cultural identity than the new owner. How do you handle resistance to what can be perceived as a bland corporate culture?
Do you want me to take it?
You're probably.
Do you want me to take it? I like this question. Although, what does a stronger cultural identity mean? I guess, but I think we've seen over the last few years, a lot of new entrants coming into the market, a lot of disruptors, a lot of businesses that are driven off of the back of technological innovation, and they've been able to grow rapidly and buy and acquire some bigger companies that are maybe on their way out, that have got sort of maybe what you would call a stronger cultural identity, a stronger brand. And I think it's quite a tricky one to integrate the two scenarios there, because you've got on one hand, you've got a business that is highly performing, that will see itself as speed, adaptable, and then you've got the other hand, you've got the other company that's probably protecting its structures and its brand and maybe being a little bit more risk averse. And one is going to see one as slow and cumbersome, and the other one's going to see the other way around and say, they're chaotic and taking too much risk. And so I think again, no silver bullet to this, and I think you gradually have to see an understanding of the businesses coming together, where one business can see the one maybe with the sort of stronger sort of cultural identity that may be seen as a bit bland and boring. They can see the value in innovation. They can see the value in fail fast. You need to be able to sort of demonstrate that to them, and eventually they will start seeing its success and emulating that. And then vice versa, those that are maybe not happy with the red tape and the bureaucracy that comes with maybe that corporate culture, actually see the value in some of it and adapt it in a way that works for them whilst maintaining that innovative sense. So, can I still get requisite reviews or approvals or whatever it might be through my governance chain, but can I do it at speed and can I do it at pace? So I think it's about molding them together and taking the best of both, but doing it gradually over time. You can't just do that in one go, and it's not one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Before we move on to thinking about bringing to life what actually happens to support whilst a merger is happening, or kind of the key point of the merger rather than prior to it, I'll just address a question that Elizabeth Spur has submitted. So thank you very much. Elizabeth asks, what do the panel think are the key considerations or questions for the management team of the company being acquired? And we've spoken about management involvement and how important that is. Are there any key questions we should be asking?
I think a key question that I think you have to ask each member of the management team of the acquired organization is, why are we doing this? Mm-hmm. If they can't tell you, if they can't tell each other why this is happening, why it makes sense, and why everybody needs to get on board, then that's going to spread like wildfire. And I've seen firsthand the sort of insurgency that can take place when starting with any layer of management, especially toward upper management. If somebody's not on board, then that cascades through the ranks, and that can make it very, very difficult to get anything done. Often because people feel that there's still some chance that even once the transaction has taken place, that maybe it'll go back to the way it was. And without being fully bought in and having that ubiquitous across the management team, and having them be able to truthfully stand in front of the transaction team and say, this is why this is being done, this is why it's good, this is why everyone needs to get on board, it's just not going to catch on.
Thank you.
And I think I'd be asking, what's the leadership style like? Are you micromanagement or are you standoff? Do you allow people to work autonomously? Is there a team working culture? What happens when something goes wrong? Do people look for blame? That's obviously one that comes up a lot actually. How quickly does it take for you to get either a product to market or a new offering to market, and is that speed and agility and innovation a core part of who you are? What's the work environment like? I think there's quite a multitude of questions you can ask in that sort of what we said earlier about running surveys or interviews or research. I think it's focusing on those types of topics because those sorts of questions are going to get out the differences.
I think it's important to understand the history as well, and
Huge.
how much change they've been through already. So I'd be really interested in that point, because are you about to implement something where they've just gone through a crazy amount of change in the past sort of 5 years, and so is this a real change overload for them? And equally, have they not had much change? So it's going to be a real, we've always done it this way, and they're going to be you'll be dragging them through it as such. So that, understanding the history is a huge thing, because otherwise you will just pitch whatever you're about to pitch completely off the mark if you don't establish where they've come from, what they've done.
I'm a big fan of getting change managers in the room for portfolio planning, for instance, which kind of links to what you were just saying, Becky, because they are best placed to understand how much an organisation can cope in terms of change, levels of change, and how much they've had previously impacts that, of course, and everything else that's coming up. So the bigger picture rather than just what's happening for that one transformation or that one project is really important.
How much change can they absorb right now?
Which is great when you have some discretion from a portfolio perspective and being able to time transactions according to when there might be a sweet spot in that particular organization. Not always the case, but try and find it where you can.
Not when it's a government that you will be doing it at this date. No.
Quite right. Yeah.
So you have to sort of work within those parameters.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Pete Davis asked a question. So I was going to pose to the panel. How would you approach cultural integration differently dependent on the type of organisation? And Becky, you alluded at the beginning it might be different if one of those parties is a startup that might not have a strong cultural identity. And obviously we know from the panel we've got an experience of public and private sector between all of us. So are there different ways that you would approach public and private sectors in this situation?
I mean, I think it depends whether it's a public and private merging together, or whether we're talking about purely public and public. But
you've done both.
Yes. So I think I saw Pete's question. I think it is an interesting question, especially on the back of actually when you said, Grant, how you can have different incentives even for retaining people, and I thought, well, that's great in the private sector, but you don't get to do that in the public sector. So you don't have financial incentives that you can give to people or any money to throw at it. And as I said, often that it's been told it's happening by X date. So you kind of have to shape it and appeal to the people, I think, in a slightly different way. Given that a lot of, this isn't true for everyone, but a lot of the people in that civil service or that public sector kind of, they're working for a department that they're either passionate about or they've got history for, or that they really believe in the purpose of it. So you normally have to appeal to them in that way. So it's a kind of, this is how this merger or acquisition is going to improve public service, or this is how it's going to make these people's lives better in this way, or whether it's healthcare or education or whatever it is. So it's a slightly different way of framing the comms and engagement around that, and also what's in it for them, because it could be much more focused on career opportunities and training and development, rather than financial benefits of you're going to get this or the other. It's actually, this is how you're going to do it. And we may be, we're going to refocus your training because that's being automated, but it means that you can be more hands-on and you can have a bit of experience. So I think it is quite different from my perspective. And then when there's a public and a private sort of coming together again, there's different approaches, but probably back to Mark previously, of that finding that commonality. So that's, instead of focusing on what the differences are, actually can we focus on which things are the same. And when I've done it before, you actually realise there's a hell of a lot more there than people think. They'll assume we're completely different. You can't possibly know what it's like to be a civil servant for 25 years. And then they'll be like, well, you can't possibly know what it's like because you've never had to work for targets or financial targets. So how can you? So you have to acknowledge the differences, but I think there needs to be less focus on them and much more focus on the similarities and what that looks like, rather than, so people always default to the negative. So it's continually refocusing to that. Why are we doing this? To Grant's point, and then also, what is that going to look like for us, and what are the positives for doing this?
You have to also look at customer centricity.
Yeah.
I think so. The question, which Becky absolutely addressed, is what are the differences? But the common thread here needs to be, how obsessed can you possibly be with the outcomes that you are delivering for your customers? And quite rightly so. Often people join public service, be it as a civil servant or otherwise in the public sector, because they care about the mission, they care about the customer, and that may manifest itself slightly differently in a public sector organization versus a private sector organization. But at the end of the day, everybody is there because they have some degree of obsession with delivering value and delivering outcomes for their customers. And the purity of that pursuit can often vary organization by organization, but tapping into the demand among the workforces, among the parties of these transactions, that can be a really strong common thread. And finding commonality amongst everyone, as far as why is it that we get up in the morning? Why do we come to work? What are we here to do? That can be a really strong factor to bring them together, despite the differences, depending on the type of organization.
Yeah, that's so true. It's transferring from that inward looking to actually outward looking, because again, you can default when it's a merger to it suddenly becomes very insular and inward looking to what's happening to us and our organisation, where actually you forget what your purpose is, and that you are still there to deliver that service and to the customer, and whether that's private or public is still the same. It drives people the same.
Remembering what this means for your customers.
Yeah.
Guaranteed there's going to be an impact ultimately on the delivery of products or services to the end customer. And so keeping that in mind and planning that in as well. Culture is not just amongst employees, it's very much among customers as well. And I know there was a question that came through about that. Yeah,
there was successful M&As assess the expectations of both customers and employees. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And just to touch on something you said around noticing the similarities, we've talked a lot about change, clearly keeping the status quo in some elements of the good bits of both companies is important as well. And I think about Oaklyn as an example here. We are growing as an organisation, and it comes up in conversation a lot. What do we want to keep as part of our culture, rather than talk about change and growing, etc.? We need to keep some of the basic principles that we set out to achieve when we were first created, and that's just as important about what needs to be different as well. How would you approach a carve out differently? And I'm gonna throw this one to Mark for obvious reasons.
I think there are different flavours that you've got. Carve outs or split offs or divestments are ultimately used by businesses to generate capital for investment. I think if you take a divestment scenario, particularly that I've seen over the last few years, you end up you've got three entities here. You've got a seller, you've got an entity that they are selling, and you've got the acquirer. So you've got the acquirer in the same way that we've sort of been talking about so far, that will have their own culture, their own sort of spin on the way that they would want things to work. And you've got a seller who, is sort of disposing of an entity, and they want to maintain their culture. They're not selling their culture. They're not getting rid of that. They want to keep that culture. And then you've got the company in the middle that slightly orphaned. They don't know where they're going to. They can't take some of the culture that they have with them necessarily. I mean, some of it is embedded into, as Becky said, the heritage and the history of the business, and they're not taking that with them. It's not as if the whole company's going. It's just part of it. So I think for a buying entity in that scenario, they have to really consider that the divested entity they're buying isn't orphaned, and they have to create a bright vision for them to move into. It's a slightly different scenario maybe to other mergers and acquisitions. And then obviously the selling business that's just divested an entity, they don't want their culture disrupted by this. And actually they could be losing friends, colleagues through that process. And many of whom will be an important key part of the culture of that organisation. So they shouldn't forget that they also need to understand how that will impact their own culture, and they may need to put some protections in place to save it.
Thank you. And I'm going to draw on something you mentioned, Becky, during your introduction. So you mentioned that you have been part of driving change, where you are impacted by it all, which I found really interesting, because I've both been in-house as a change management lead and been a consultant, where you are, I guess, perceived as doing change to other companies, not just being not impacted by it yourself, because you will be transitionary and leave that organisation. So how have you dealt with that, being impacted by a change you are also driving?
So I think there's a few different ways of dealing with it, and I've dealt with it in not so great ways as well. So I've done a few. So I think when I haven't dealt with it as well, it's probably where I've kind of taken on board too much what the people that I work with and their opinions and everything, and took it too personally, and really tried to incorporate absolutely everything, and tried to make it the best for everyone, which was good intentions, but actually there does get to a point where you have to actually make some hard decisions and separate yourself. So where I've done it in a better way is to still have that line, and to make it clear when you are dealing with it, and actually when you're talking to friends and colleagues about it, saying, I'm talking to you in this capacity, and I understand and appreciate where you're coming from. I've been there, so you can empathise, but actually still making that real clear distinction that just because I'm Becky, we worked with you for 10 years, and so you think I'm going to try and influence that for you and make sure that gets in one of the benefits that we put in, but actually really clear that you can't do that, and that you are in that professional capacity, that you will take everything on board, and actually just more play to the fact that you do have that experience, and that you hopefully have earned their respect and trust that you will incorporate everything without doing anyone a favour. So that for me was quite a steep learning curve on a couple of earlier ones, where you can't be everyone's friend, and so you do need to make that real distinction. But it also made me really focus on what happens after day one, because there's always such a focus on, that's the same with any project or program. It's all about when's the live date, and that's just one of your milestones. That's not the end milestone. So I think hopefully where I've managed to play in a bit there of going, well, actually, trying to visualise what is this going to look like in 6 months, 12 months, 1, 2, 3, years down the line, where you can play that in, because you understand the history, you understand the people a bit more, and you understand how that change is going to be perceived. So again, love a bit of planning, and so I'd say it's really acknowledging that it isn't just, like you mentioned it before, 2 weeks and then we're done. It's actually really making it clear to people what that change will look like, and that it is a phased process, because I think people think once you've merged, that it's like just magically happens, and we've got this magic culture. So it's managing expectations of not only the people but the exec board and leadership team, that this doesn't, just because you can do all that prep work doesn't mean that you land and then everything's perfect. You kind of open the door, and now you've got to enact on all of those things and be true to your word of all the things that you committed to and promised as well. I think is a key thing, because everyone is a big, it will look like this and it will be like that, and it can be a typical almost political thing of this is our manifesto and it's going to look amazing and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And if you don't actually follow through on any of that, you will lose not only the engagement but also the trust of all that, and that's a very hard place for a leadership team to.
It's an early test of credibility, isn't it?
Yes.
As this new shaped organization.
Yeah.
If you don't make good on the promises that you made to get people on board initially, what good is your word?
Exactly that. So if you're going to, if one of your incentives is that there are more opportunities in training and learning development, get that in straight away and show how that is going to look and how they can start accessing that even pre-merger or immediately after, so they can see those tangible benefits straight away, and then they're much more likely to then, believe the other stuff that you said for a start and then adopt that culture. Otherwise you're just always on that bit of a back foot and just think that you've just been a typical kind of selling something that you couldn't actually deliver.
Thank you. And we've kind of moved into talking about after the merger. Mark, have you got any comments?
I'll just echo a bit about what Becky just said, actually. So day one, or the point of the merger, is really the start of the transition, and it's a long journey from there. The other thing is it's a real key point. People are expecting change. From a change management point of view, people think something new's happening here. They're willing to accept and hear what you've got to say, and what you want to do. So I think it's a really good point to actually enact your plan, and it's not, don't dwell on it. Don't wait for the things to rise up and go wrong before starting to try and fix them. It's better late than never, but try and get on the front foot. And the other thing Becky said that I'd add to as well is targeting those critical things. First, the most important things that can have the biggest impact. Try and focus on those first.
Okay, thank you very much, all. I'll just provide some of my key takeaways before I open it up to final remarks from the rest of the panel. So I thought it was really important what was spoken about at the beginning around what you can do before the merger. Just because you can't access everyone you want to access in the organisation, your hands aren't tied. Let's make some effort to actually find out what the existing cultures might be like, what things we want to retain. Leadership are very important, but also identifying those key players that might be resistors or change advocates as well, and making friends with them early on, I think, is very important too. You can have cultural KPIs, even though culture isn't often something that is described as something we can touch and feel, and it's not numbers on a spreadsheet. You can measure a baseline at the beginning, and obviously then continuously throughout the transformation as well, which will help you identify where you might need to do things differently. And that goes beyond, obviously, the integration finishing when you think about retention and other things we touched on as well. And then something that Becky and Grant, you both picked up on. So financial incentives don't always work, dependent on what the organisation is. So for a public sector organisation where you can't offer financial incentives, you have to work out what makes those employees tick to help them along the journey, I guess. And then we know that it doesn't end at day one. We need to make sure that we understand that there are things that are going to need to happen post-merger. Things aren't going to be completely perfect, and that needs to be taken into consideration during the planning as well, and benefiting and demonstrating benefits straight away will help, I guess, push that journey along. But yeah, things don't end on day one. There's always still more work to be done. So I'll just open it up to you for the final closing comments before we finish off.
So I think, as I said in my introduction, I think we need to try and find a way of elevating cultural change and cultural integration up the importance when we're talking about M&A versus sort of the financial aspects. A lot of focus is on synergies and alignment of systems and personnel and all designs. And I think the challenge that we will have is to articulate to our leadership and our management teams in these organisations to say actually culture is up there with equal importance. It's intrinsically linked to a business's value and growth. And if we can do that, then it will become top of the agenda for future M&A.
Thank you.
I think I saw a question actually you kind of almost answered, which was around sort of how do you, I think it's gone up the screen a bit, with something around how do you persuade or convince a leadership team to put it at the top of the agenda when there are conflicting priorities. And I think, like I say, it's showing the impact that it has. So, and for me, I love a stat and some data, and you can't argue with the numbers. So if you've got some information on actually early on of this is if we don't do this well, this is what it will look like, and this is actually the trends and how it can negatively impact, and this is what it does look like for you in a few years if you don't address this now. I think it's getting on that front foot and having that, being armed with that data and information of why it is important, because it is out there now, and then that kind of sticks with people, and then it always gives you that something to always revert back to of why you're doing it and why they said that you could plan that in and do those things. So yeah, for me it's getting on the front foot and really knowing, reinforcing and knowing why it's important.
Thank you.
And I would just say change, especially in the context of M&A, is difficult and time-consuming and often expensive. And making sure that expectations are set well in advance amongst leadership, so that there aren't corners cut and there aren't any surprises when something needs to be redone, when an org chart needs to be recut, when something requires additional investment of time, especially internal resources where there tends to be, people are spread pretty thinly, especially following a major transaction like this, where people's jobs are generally being rewritten, and the value system that drives them at work and their interactions with customers are often very different. And there's a real settling in period there that has to take place. And so making sure that all of those allocations of time and attention and money are there, and those expectations have been set with leadership, will help to avoid disappointment and to ensure that the right resources are there at the right time to ensure that you get over the line and ultimately deliver the value that you set out to in the first place by virtue of an M&A transaction.
Thank you very much. Almost exactly on time, finishing. Thank you for your time, panelists, and also for everybody that attended too. Would be happy to continue the conversation. So please find us on LinkedIn. We haven't obviously had any slides to share, but happy to answer any other questions offline, which we can discuss with CMI. Also, CMI have got some really good events coming up over the next few weeks. So do have a look at what those are on their website and subscribe to their newsletter if you haven't already. So enjoy the rest of your Monday. Thank you again, everyone, and see you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.